The president has made something of an industry out of his use of nicknames. There are a lot of things. They're biting, personal, most are juvenile, many of them stick. Think of the public officials who have put in decades of public service only to wear a nickname like Little or Low Energy or Crooked for the rest of their lives. And there's something else at work here. As Phil Rucker of the Washington Post points out tonight, the president's decision to call Omarosa a dog is not new or very surprising. His article is titled in part, quote, "Trump has a long history of using canine insults to dehumanize enemies," which led us to this brief reminder.
We have a dirty dog like that who's no good, who's a failure. They were fired like dogs.
You got Rubio doing poorly, and he sweats like a dog.
I'm watching Marco sweating like a dog. Now, Romney choked, okay? He choked like a dog.
He was choking like a dog.
Choked like a dog. Mitt Romney couldn't run for dog catcher.
Hillary Clinton couldn't be elected dog catcher.
I'm watching television, and I see her barking like a dog, right? No, she's barking like a dog. What was that? Is that a dog?
Phil Rucker has nicely agreed to stick around this late to talk to us about this topic. Phil, we just hope no one in the dog community is watching. Does this president really physically not like dogs?
That's right, Brian. He's actually the first president in more than 100 years who's not had a dog as a pet in the White House. He has lived with a dog before. When he first got married to his first wife, Ivana, she brought with her a poodle. He resisted the dog. He didn't want to have anything to do with the poodle, but she said, the poodle's coming along, Chappie's coming along. Turns out Chappie didn't like Trump very much, because whenever Trump would come near Ivana's closet, Chappie would bark at him territorially. Ivana writes about this in her memoir that came out a few months ago.
We launched an extensive web search that took us at least a few minutes, and we could only find one photo extant in all the land of Donald Trump with a dog. Check out the expression on the Scotty's face here, but this is the this was the Best in Show at the Westminster Show a couple years back in Trump's now famous office in Trump Tower. Let's call that a mutual admiration society. Phil, the fact is he's been a germaphobe for a lot of his life. There was a period of time, people here in New York remember, when he did not bring himself to shake hands when he met people. So maybe this is all of a piece. I don't know.
Well, clearly he's not comfortable living with animals in the house. He doesn't have any pets, and he uses dog as if it's some sort of like negative thing. In American culture, you know, a lot of Americans love dogs. They're loyal. They love you back. A lot of people have dogs as pets. In other cultures, in the Middle East, for example, dogs are seen as dirty, so it's a more effective attack line. But Trump clearly doesn't seem to care much for dogs as animals in the house.
Full disclosure, dogs are easily 80% of our family text thread. And I have to read you a quote. There is a great book about the pets of presidents called First Dogs, co-authored by Brooke Janis and the great Roy Rowan. And Brooke Janis says this: "This is a president who needs a friend. Having a dog offers unconditional love, and that is something that this president desires so deeply and can't seem to find." Our friend Phil Rucker had the good sense of quoting the co-author in his piece tonight. But I guess he will continue to use it as kind of the ultimate put-down. It was bracing for Americans to read that word in relation to this woman we've come to know on television and who was, until recently, a White House aide.
Yeah, I think that's right, Brian. And we've been making light a little bit of the president not wanting to have a dog in the house, but it's deadly serious what he does with that word, using it as an attack. He's dehumanizing his enemies. That's the goal there. And there's a long history, actually, of authoritarian leaders who've used these animalistic slurs as insults to dehumanize individuals or groups of people. We remember during the Holocaust, the Nazis would call Jews rats. I interviewed a philosophy professor who explained this history and how it's a very useful image for leaders to use to try to stir up resentments between us and them in a society. So there's a pattern here through history. I think Donald Trump is smart enough and strategic enough to know what he's doing by repeatedly using the imagery of a dog as a slur to attack his perceived political enemies.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching. watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.